So, this place still stands. It should have fallen years ago. And so who rebuilt it?
You remembered the way home. I wasn't expecting that.
Emilia? How did you become all this?
Julian Westwood married a woman society forgot to notice.
That was the joke whispered behind fans and wineglasses, the day he stood at the altar beside her, a bride in faded linen. Eyes lowered, a name nobody thought worth remembering. He signed the papers his grandfather's will demanded, mocked her plainness in front of 300 guests, and rode for the capital before the flowers on her borrowed gown had wilted. He left her a crumbling estate, a handful of coins, and strict instructions never to write unless someone had died. He assumed the silence that followed meant she'd faded quietly, the way he'd planned. 5 years later, a storm forced him back through those same gates, and what waited for him at the top of the stone steps was not a woman who had disappeared. It was a woman who had built an entire kingdom out of everything he'd thrown away.
The rain hadn't even stopped falling before he understood he was no longer welcome in the home he'd abandoned.
Stay close. What waits for Julian on those stone steps is not the ending anyone predicted, it's the one he built with his own cruelty, and now has to face.
Emilia, how did you become all this?
The chapel at Ashcombe Hollow had not seen a wedding in 11 years, and it showed. Cold seeped up through the stone floor. Candles guttered in the draught from a broken window nobody had bothered to repair. Julian Westwood stood at the altar in a coat worth more than the church's entire yearly upkeep, arms crossed, jaw set, already counting the minutes until this obligation ended.
Beside him, Emilia kept her eyes on the frayed hem of her borrowed gown. The priest spoke the words quickly, as though he too understood this was less a marriage than a transaction being witnessed. Julian answered his vows the way a man signs a contract he hasn't read flat, automatic, already elsewhere. When it came time for Emilia to speak hers, her voice was quiet but steady, steady enough that a few of the gathered relatives exchanged surprised glances.
Steady wasn't what Julian noticed.
What he noticed was the plain wool of her dress, the unstyled knot of her hair, the absence of jewels, of powder, of anything that marked her as belonging in the world he moved through. And when the priest pronounced them bound, Julian didn't reach for her hand. He turned to the small, curious crowd instead and let his voice carry. "Well," he said, "the inheritance is secured." His eyes swept over her once, dismissively. "Though I admit I've never seen a bride so committed to blending into the furniture." Laughter rippled through the pews, soft, cruel, delighted. Emilia's spine straightened almost imperceptibly. She said nothing. Julian pressed a small purse into her palm on his way past. "For the household," he said, "don't write unless someone dies." And then he was gone, his boots echoing down the aisle, out through the doors, into a waiting carriage that would carry him back to a life she wasn't invited into. The ink on the register was still wet when the doors closed behind him. The road to Oakhaven Manor took 4 days, and with every mile, the world grew colder and quieter, until the trees themselves seemed to lean away from the estate, rising out of the mist ahead. Grey stone streaked black with old rain. Ivy is strangling the windows, half the shutters hanging loose, groaning faintly with every gust of wind, like the house itself was exhaling something it had been holding for years. 3 servants waited at the entrance. An elderly housekeeper with tired eyes, a groundskeeper too old for the grounds he was meant to keep, a kitchen girl who couldn't have been more than 15, clutching her shawl against the cold. "Your Grace," the housekeeper said, the title landing strangely, as though she wasn't sure it was meant for someone dressed so simply. "We received no instructions." No funds, either, not for some time.
Emilia stepped past her into the entrance hall, and the cold followed her inside because inside was barely warmer than out. Dust sheets draped the furniture like something laid to rest. Her breath fogged in front of her face. Somewhere above, a loose shutter knocked against stone, slow and relentless, counting seconds she hadn't asked to count.
That night, alone in a room with no fire, she allowed herself exactly 1 hour to cry. Then she stopped and did not cry again for a very long time. The coin purse lasted 3 weeks. Emilia sat at an old writing desk, buried under dust, and spread the estate's ledgers in front of her by candlelight, years of neglect recorded in fading ink. Debts left unpaid, tenants left unvisited, fields gone fallow because no one had thought it worth the effort. She could have written to Julian, begged if it came to that. Some small, tired part of her considered it.
She didn't.
Instead, she summoned the housekeeper, Mrs. Hollis. She'd learned into the study the next morning, her hands still cold from the unheated room. "I want the truth of everything we have," Emilia said. "Every debt, every acre, every coin left in this house, however small." Her voice didn't waver, though her fingers, hidden beneath the desk, gripped the edge of her chair. "I intend to understand this place before it decides what becomes of me."
Mrs. Hollis blinked, caught somewhere between doubt and disbelief. "Your Grace, the fields haven't yielded in 3 years. The tenants have long since stopped expecting."
"Then we give them something to expect again," Emilia said. "Starting tomorrow." It was a small decision, made in a cold room by a woman with nothing but a handful of coins and a stack of old ledgers. But it was the first decision she had made entirely for herself since the wedding day, and something in the set of her jaw suggested it would not be the last. She rose before dawn now, wrapped in a coat too large for her, a spade heavy in gloved hands, still soft from a life that had never asked her to work. The gardens greeted her like an accusation, rose beds choked with thorn and neglect, herb beds long since surrendered to weeds, the old stone paths buried under years of fallen leaves. She started there because starting somewhere was better than starting nowhere. Dead growth cleared. Frozen soil turned, one aching handful at a time. Whatever hardy seed Mrs. Hollis could find rattling in the bottom of old jars, pressed into the earth with fingers that blistered, then calloused, then simply endured.
Some mornings, the cold bit so deep she couldn't feel her own hands by midday. She kept working anyway.
The groundskeeper, watching her from a distance for the better part of a week, finally set down his own tools and joined her without a word. The kitchen girl began smuggling seedlings from her family's plot at the edge of the village. Even Mrs. Hollis, who had long since resigned herself to watching Oakhaven slowly disappear, found herself sorting seed packets by candlelight, murmuring under her breath about which would survive the frost and which wouldn't. By the time the first true thaw arrived, green shoots had broken through soil that hadn't produced anything but weeds in over a decade. Emilia stood at the edge of the garden one grey morning, dirt beneath her fingernails, and felt something rise in her chest she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the church doors closed behind her husband.
It felt cautiously, I like hope.
News from the capital reached Oakhaven, the way gossip always travels slow, second-hand, dressed up richer with every mile it crossed. Julian was seen everywhere that mattered. Julian was seen everywhere that mattered. Ballrooms, card tables, the company of women whose names appeared in every fashionable column. He was, by every account that reached the estate, exactly the man he had always been, charming to strangers, careless with everyone else, utterly untouched by the wife left behind in the cold. One letter, passed along by a traveling merchant, mentioned him laughing at a dinner party about the quiet little bride tucked away in the country, as though her existence were nothing more than an amusing story he liked to tell. Amelia read the account once by firelight and felt strangely far from the girl it described, because that girl, the one who had cried for exactly 1 hour in a freezing room, felt further away with every season that passed. In her place stood someone who balanced the estate's books herself, who had coaxed 3 thriving fields out of what had once been dead earth, who now paid 6 servants fairly and on time, instead of the 3 who'd greeted her with tired, doubtful eyes.
She stopped waiting for a letter that would never come.
And somewhere in the quiet, unglamorous work of building something real out of nothing, she stopped needing one at all. 5 years had passed, and the storm that finally drove Julian back through Oakhaven's gates felt less like weather and more like judgment. His carriage had lost a wheel 2 miles out, forcing him onto horseback through rain that fell in sheets, soaking through a coat that had once turned heads in every ballroom in the capital. He hadn't planned this visit. A property dispute over a border he'd forgotten existed had demanded the Duchess's signature, a formality, he'd assumed, a quick errand before returning to the life he actually cared about. He hadn't expected the gates, wrought iron, newly oiled, closed firmly against the storm instead of hanging broken on rusted hinges the way he remembered. Beyond them, light, warm and gold, pouring from windows he could have sworn belonged to a ruin. A gatekeeper he didn't recognize studied him for a long moment before letting him through. And Julian rode up the drive with rain in his eyes and a strange, unfamiliar unease tightening in his chest. The gardens struck him first. Roses climbed trellises that hadn't existed when he left, thick, deliberate, thriving even under the storm's weight. Hedges trimmed with a precision that spoke of years, not weeks. The old fountain, which he remembered choked with dead leaves, ran clear and full, despite the rain hammering its surface. He stepped through the manor's front doors and stopped. No dust, no damp, rotting air. Instead, wood smoke, fresh bread, polished floors reflecting chandelier light which he hadn't paid to install. A household staff moved through the halls with quiet purpose, none of them glancing his way for instruction, none of them slowing at the sight of him at all. Mrs. Hollis appeared from a side hallway, older now, standing straighter than he remembered. "Your Grace." Her voice was polite, careful, entirely without warmth. "We weren't expecting you." "Clearly," Julian said, water pooling at his boots on floors too clean for the mess he'd tracked in. "Where is my wife?" Something flickered behind Mrs. Hollis's eyes. Not quite amusement, not quite triumph. "Her Grace is in the East Garden. She'll receive you when she's finished." "And Maya?" Julian, a man unaccustomed to waiting for anyone, found himself waiting anyway. She appeared at the top of the staircase just as thunder rolled through the sky outside, lightning flashing white across the tall windows behind her. Julian looked up and forgot entirely how to speak. The girl he remembered quiet, plain, easily overlooked, was gone. In her place stood a woman, lit gold from behind, her chestnut hair loose over her shoulders, a cream gown catching the chandelier's glow, like something out of a painting he'd have paid a fortune for and never understood. She didn't rush down to greet him. She wasn't curtsy. She simply stood at the top of her own staircase and looked down at him the way one might look at an uninvited guest tracking mud across a floor they'd spent years restoring. Amelia, who? Her name felt foreign in his mouth after so many years of silence. "Your Grace." Her voice carried no warmth, no relief, nothing he could grasp onto. "I confess, I didn't expect you to remember the way here." Old instinct rose in him, the reflex of a man used to command. "There are papers requiring your signature, a matter at Millbrook. Then leave them with Mrs. Hollis." Her gaze didn't waver, didn't soften. I review estate matters in the morning with my steward, not on my own doorstep, in the rain, at the convenience of a man who hasn't set foot here in 5 years. Julian opened his mouth to argue and found, for the first time in his life, that he had no authority left to reach for. He stayed the night. There was no returning through the storm, and even his pride had limits it wouldn't cross in the dark. The next morning, over a breakfast he hadn't been invited to but attended anyway, he tried to resume some old rhythm of command, questioning the household accounts, suggesting management changes he no longer understood. Amelia listened with the patience of a woman humoring a stranger, then corrected each point with figures he couldn't dispute. Yields doubled, debts repaid in full, tenant agreements renegotiated fairly, honored faithfully, year after year. She wasn't defending her work, she was simply stating a fact the way someone corrects a visitor's mistaken assumption about a house they'd never actually lived in. By afternoon, he'd stopped trying to manage what wasn't his to manage and started, instead, to watch. He watched the walk garden she'd built with blistered, patient hands. He watched staff greet her, not with fear, but with something closer to devotion. He watched an old groundskeeper laugh, easy and unguarded, at something she'd said, a warmth Julian realized, with a slow and uncomfortable jolt, he had never once earned from anyone in his own life. Every servant in that house answered her, not because she demanded it, because she'd earned it, one cold winter at a time, while he was elsewhere, laughing at a story about a wife he'd assumed would quietly disappear.
That evening, he found her walking the edge of the rose garden, alone, the storm finally breaking into a soft, silvered rain.
I came here, he said quietly, expecting to find the woman I left behind. He held her gaze, something unfamiliar and unpracticed, moving behind his eyes, not the bored contempt of the altar, but something rawer. Instead, I find someone who built an entire life that doesn't need me anywhere in it. Amelia turned to face him fully, rain catching in her hair like scattered light. You didn't leave me a life, Julian. You left me a ruin and a warning to fade quietly into it. Everything you see here I built despite you, not because of you. I know that. His voice dropped, stripped of its old arrogance. I'm not asking you to forget what I did. I'm asking whether there's any room left here for a man willing to earn it properly this time. Thunder rolled softly in the distance, further away now, retreating. Amelia studied him for a long moment, searching for the man who had mocked her in front of 300 strangers, and finding, instead, someone smaller, quieter, genuinely uncertain for what might have been the first time in his life. The following morning, golden light spilled across the staircase, where he'd first seen her, the same steps, the same glow, the same roses climbing the stone behind her, though everything about the moment felt entirely different now. You may stay, Amelia said finally, her voice even, deliberate, as a guest. Nothing more. Not yet. She let the silence stretch, letting him feel the full weight of it. If you want anything beyond that, you'll have to earn it exactly the way I earned everything you see in front of you. Slowly, honestly, starting from the ground, like everyone else in this house already has. She turned and walked back toward the open doors of Oakhaven, warm light spilling out to meet her, leaving Julian standing on the steps in the cool morning air, no longer a duke commanding a household, but simply a man given, for the first time, the rare and uncertain chance to become someone worth staying for. Whether he would ever truly walk through those doors as more than a guest, only time and Amelia herself would decide.
Some homes are built with stone and timber. Others are built with everything a person refuses to let break inside them, and once that kind of home exists, no one who abandoned it gets to walk back in and claim it as theirs. If you were Amelia, standing at the top of those steps after everything he put you through, would you have let him stay at all? Tell us where you'd have drawn the line and stay close, because the next story is already waiting behind these same doors.